On June 16, 1976, thousands of students poured into the streets of Soweto to protest the racist apartheid policies enforced by the white South African government. The demonstrations were organized by the South African Students' Movement's Action Committee, with support from the Black Consciousness Movement. The plan was to carry out a peaceful march through the streets, culminating in a massive rally at Orlando Stadium. As the students marched, they were confronted by heavily armed police forces who opened fire with live ammunition on the unarmed demonstrators in an attempt to disperse the crowd. What began as a peaceful protest quickly descended into violence. Hundreds of students were brutally beaten, arrested, and shot. News of the violent crackdown spread rapidly across the country, igniting further protests that were met with even more beatings, arrests, and killings. After 2 days of unrest, more than 500 people were dead, the majority of them schoolchildren. Images showing police firing on and killing peacefully protesting students were broadcast around the world, sparking international outrage and fueling anti-apartheid movements across the globe. In the United States, anti-apartheid movements emerged on college and university campuses, demanding that the U.S. government take action against South Africa's racist white minority government. Activists called for sanctions, disinvestment, and divestment. However, when Ronald Reagan came to power in 1980, he dramatically changed the U.S. approach toward the white minority regime in South Africa. Reagan's apartheid policy had far-reaching consequences across southern Africa, effectively sustaining the system and forcing Africans to endure 8 more years of his presidency before apartheid was finally dismantled. On January 20, 1981, Ronald Reagan, aged 69, was inaugurated as the 40th President of the United States. At the time, Africa was experiencing widespread instability. Military coups had become common, the CIA was deeply involved across the continent, and many governments were adopting socialist policies. The Angolan Civil War was ongoing, and nations such as Eritrea and Namibia had yet to gain independence. Despite these developments, the most pressing issue remained South Africa's apartheid government, which had intensified its repression of anti-apartheid protests. Apartheid was a system introduced by South Africa's National Party in 1948, designed to ensure permanent white supremacy. To maintain this dominance, the government imposed extensive controls on the black population, enforcing strict racial segregation wherever possible. Every aspect of life, housing, employment, education, public services, and political participation, was regulated to keep black South Africans in a permanently subordinate position. Under apartheid, more than 3 million people were forcibly removed from their homes to satisfy government planning objectives, while millions more were imprisoned for violating apartheid laws. The regime's intentions were openly declared. In 1956, Prime Minister Hans Strijdom told Parliament, "Either the white man dominates or the black man takes over." He further stated that white supremacy could only be maintained through domination, and domination could only continue by denying non-Europeans the right to vote, effectively turning black citizens into foreigners in their own land. The government worked relentlessly to silence dissent. Any attempt by black South Africans to resist oppression was met with harsh and violent repression. Rising tensions resulted in repeated high-profile confrontations between black communities and white police forces. The most notorious of these were the Sharpeville Massacre in 1969 and the Soweto Uprising of 1976. Due to the extreme human rights abuses inherent in apartheid and the widespread oppression of black and colored South Africans, the moral crisis of South Africa drew growing international attention. In the United States, a multiracial anti-apartheid movement demanded freedom for South Africa, prompting the Carter administration to pressure the regime through sanctions and reductions in aid in an effort to achieve a peaceful resolution. However, President Carter was defeated in the election by Ronald Reagan, ushering in a new administration. A staunch conservative, Reagan sharply reversed Carter's policies. Reagan had long held dismissive and racist views toward Africans and their leaders. During his 1965 campaign for governor of California, he remarked during a luncheon speech that when Africans have a man for lunch, they really have him for lunch. Later, while serving as governor, Reagan referred to African presidents as monkeys during a phone call with President Richard Nixon, who laughed in response. Reagan reportedly said, "To see those monkeys from those African countries, damn them, they're still uncomfortable wearing shoes." During Reagan's first term, public opposition to apartheid in the United States grew stronger. Calls for disinvestment and divestment from South Africa gained momentum, particularly on college campuses. Supporters argued that economic pressure would force the South African government into negotiations that would ultimately bring apartheid to an end. Reagan and his administration, however, strongly opposed sanctions, disinvestment, boycotts, arms embargoes, or any measures that might damage the South African economy. They claimed such actions would harm the very people they were meant to help. In May 1981, just 4 months into his presidency, Reagan welcomed South African Foreign Minister Pik Botha to the White House, an event unthinkable under the Carter administration. Upon returning to South Africa, Botha declared that his government had found a strong ally in Washington. The Reagan administration pointed to American companies operating in South Africa that employed more than 80,000 black workers, arguing that their employment practices differed from typical South African norms. Reagan's opposition to disinvestment even found support within South Africa's anti-apartheid movement, among both black and white leaders. One of those supporters was Mangosuthu Buthelezi, Chief Minister of KwaZulu and President of the Inkatha Freedom Party, who strongly opposed sanctions. This raised the question of alternatives. 2 main approaches emerged. The first was the Sullivan Principles, introduced in 1977 by Reverend Leon Sullivan, the first African American to serve on General Motors' board of directors. These principles set standards for U.S. companies operating in South Africa, calling for fair wages, equal employment, and non-segregated workplaces. The second approach was known as constructive engagement, the official policy of the Reagan administration. Developed by Chester Crocker, Assistant Secretary of State for African Affairs, this policy was based on the belief that reform could only occur if the South African government was incentivized through continued trade and diplomatic relations. Supporters of constructive engagement believed the United States could gradually influence South Africa's white minority government to abandon apartheid. They argued that change should occur incrementally rather than through revolutionary action, and that cooperation with the apartheid regime was preferable to confrontation. Although not formally linked, both constructive engagement and the Sullivan Principles claimed to aim at ending apartheid while maintaining diplomatic stability between Pretoria and Washington. In reality, both approaches failed to confront the violence and suffering caused by apartheid. Put simply, Reagan claimed to negotiate an end to apartheid while, in practice, empowering and sustaining the system itself. Supporters of the policy known as constructive engagement continue to argue that it was neither racist nor supportive of apartheid. According to them, the policy was designed to curb the spread of communism in southern Africa by cooperating with the government in Pretoria. To understand this claim, it is necessary to examine the key actors involved: the United States, South Africa, Angola, Cuba, and Namibia. By 1981, Angola was governed by the pro-communist MPLA, which was supported by more than 30,000 Cuban troops stationed in the country. Angola was also in the midst of a brutal civil war between the MPLA, led by José Eduardo dos Santos, and the rebel movement UNITA, under Jonas Savimbi. Cuban forces entered Angola at the request of the MPLA government to counter South African military incursions. South Africa justified its actions by citing fears of communist expansion and the spillover of conflict into neighboring Namibia, which it occupied at the time. South Africa also claimed that Angola's communist government had provided sanctuary to anti-apartheid groups such as the ANC, allowing them to launch attacks against the Pretoria regime. The continued presence of Cuban troops in Angola became a convenient justification for South Africa to maintain its illegal occupation of Namibia while suppressing independence movements there. South Africa's control of Namibia dated back to the First World War. In May 1915, General Louis Botha, then Prime Minister of the Union of South Africa, sent 40,000 troops into the territory, expelled German forces, and assumed control. This occupation was later formalized through a League of Nations mandate. Even after the United Nations revoked this mandate in 1966, South Africa continued to rule Namibia in violation of international law. Under President Ronald Reagan, the United States intervened, largely driven by prestige and strategic concerns, to secure the withdrawal of Cuban troops from Angola and push for a settlement on Namibian independence. American policymakers believed that Cuban withdrawal would ease Cold War tensions in the region, while Namibian independence would eliminate one of the last remnants of colonial rule and improve regional stability. Determined to avoid another Vietnam-style conflict, Reagan refused to deploy U.S. troops directly. Instead, his administration chose to wage a proxy war by backing UNITA rebels with South African assistance. Jonas Savimbi received more than $200 million in U.S. support to fight the communist MPLA government. As part of this strategy, the Reagan administration recognized South Africa's apartheid government and largely ignored its racial policies, while expecting Pretoria to eventually grant Namibia independence. However, U.S. military aid to UNITA only deepened Angola's reliance on Cuban forces. In response, Cuba sent additional troops to protect the MPLA government in Luanda, further escalating the conflict. Critics argued that Namibia's independence could have been achieved more effectively by disengaging from UNITA and focusing solely on Cuban withdrawal. Reagan rejected this approach, a decision that proved disastrous. The conflict became one of Africa's longest and deadliest civil wars, resulting in millions of deaths and displaced people, delaying Namibia's independence, and reinforcing South Africa's apartheid system. The policy of constructive engagement ultimately failed to produce meaningful results. Rather than encouraging reform, it strengthened the apartheid government in Pretoria. Public backlash intensified, and demands for tougher sanctions against South Africa grew louder. For Reagan and his Assistant Secretary of State, Chester Crocker, racial injustice was not viewed as an urgent reason to dismantle apartheid. Strategic and geopolitical priorities consistently outweighed moral considerations. Reagan openly defended the South African government, claiming it had dismantled segregation similar to what once existed in the United States. In communications with American diplomatic missions in Africa, he emphasized that U.S. policy aimed to reinforce a region of increasing strategic importance to American interests. This stance suggested little concern for the suffering of black South Africans living under institutionalized racial oppression. Many within the administration shared these views. The U.S. ambassador to the United Nations famously remarked that racism was less dangerous than Marxism. The Secretary of State echoed this sentiment, stating that Washington would acknowledge South Africa's legitimate security concerns, and warning that U.S. national interests could not be sacrificed for moral statements. In 1984, Reagan addressed the United Nations, publicly endorsing a peaceful transition away from apartheid, yet continued to avoid applying real pressure on South Africa. That same year, Archbishop Desmond Tutu received the Nobel Peace Prize for his anti-apartheid activism. When Tutu later met Reagan, the president repeated his constructive engagement rhetoric. However, during a congressional hearing, Tutu condemned the policy as a moral failure, calling it an unmitigated disaster and asserting that neutrality in the face of apartheid was impossible. After their meeting, Reagan dismissed criticism by suggesting it was unhelpful for one nation to publicly pressure another and claimed that some black leaders supported U.S. investment in South Africa. This was an attempt to undermine Tutu's argument that American policy harmed black South Africans. Tutu's speech marked a turning point. In the same year, Reverend Leon Sullivan expanded the Sullivan Principles, urging U.S. companies not only to promote workplace equality but also to publicly oppose apartheid laws, encourage equal rights, and support better living conditions for black workers. This expansion coincided with a visible failure of constructive engagement. Although Crocker attempted to present the Sullivan Principles as evidence of success, Sullivan himself distanced his program from the Reagan administration. Anti-apartheid activists continued to criticize the principles for indirectly sustaining the white minority government. By 1987, Sullivan abandoned the initiative entirely, calling for all American companies to leave South Africa and for a total U.S. embargo until apartheid ended. By the conclusion of Reagan's first term, it was evident that constructive engagement had failed. Rather than moderating apartheid, South Africa intensified its racial policies, confident that U.S. protection would shield it from serious international consequences. Ironically, Pretoria itself had grown resentful of the policy, even as it benefited from it. Senior officials of the apartheid government believed that the policy of constructive engagement was merely a pretext used by the United States to interfere in South Africa's domestic affairs. On August 15, 1985, South African President P.W. Botha delivered a highly anticipated speech in which many expected him to announce sweeping reforms, including the release of Nelson Mandela. Instead, Botha avoided addressing any of these issues, despite escalating unrest across the country. This address later became known as the Rubicon speech. In the speech, Botha declared that South Africa would never accept a system based on one man, one vote within a unitary state. He argued that genuine democracy would result in disorder and instability. Concluding his remarks, he famously stated, "I believe that we are today crossing the Rubicon. There can be no turning back." Following the speech, pressure intensified both within South Africa and internationally. Widespread protests inside the country led the government to impose martial law. Meanwhile, violence against black-majority opposition groups increased and was broadcast nightly by U.S. news outlets. In response, African Americans, university students, and other civil rights activists in the United States began urging Congress to act against the apartheid regime, particularly as President Reagan remained reluctant to do so. As criticism grew, Chester Crocker was compelled to testify before the Senate and defend the policy of constructive engagement amid accusations that it had failed. In September 1984, during a hearing before the Senate Foreign Relations Committee, Crocker insisted that the policy was effective despite the escalating violence in South Africa. He argued that rising black unrest and police brutality often occurred at moments when rigid systems were beginning to collapse. By this stage, many Americans had lost patience. In April 1985, Democratic senators attempted to pass the Anti-Apartheid Act, but their efforts were blocked by a Republican filibuster. President Ronald Reagan viewed the legislation as an encroachment on his authority over foreign policy and warned that he would veto it if it passed. To relieve mounting pressure, Reagan introduced his own sanctions, which Democrats criticized as weak and ineffective. In a 1986 speech, Reagan condemned the African National Congress, ANC, the organization leading the struggle against apartheid, accusing it of engaging in calculated terror, including road mining and bombings of public places aimed at provoking further repression. When the South African government officially labeled the ANC a terrorist organization, the Reagan administration adopted the same stance. At the time, the ANC received strong support from the Soviet Union, which aided its efforts to dismantle apartheid and secure voting rights for black and colored South Africans. Hope resurfaced in 1986 when a comprehensive anti-apartheid bill was reintroduced in Congress. The legislation sought to impose strict sanctions on South Africa and outlined 5 conditions for lifting them, conditions that would effectively bring apartheid to an end. With bipartisan backing from both Democrats and Republicans, the bill passed by a veto-proof margin of 84-14. As he had previously warned, Reagan vetoed the bill on September 26, arguing that it would worsen violence and encourage Marxist influence. In response, Archbishop Desmond Tutu strongly criticized Reagan, stating that a leader who readily imposed sanctions on Poland, Nicaragua, and Libya refused to take meaningful action against one of the world's most brutal systems. He asserted that apartheid would ultimately be dismantled and that history would judge President Reagan harshly. In the days leading up to the vote to override the veto, it became evident that many Republicans were prepared to oppose the president. Reagan then asked South African Foreign Minister Pik Botha to contact undecided Republican senators in an attempt to prevent the override. Despite these efforts, Republican Senator Richard Lugar led the movement to overturn the veto, breaking with a president he had usually supported. Speaking on the Senate floor, Lugar declared, "We are against tyranny, and tyranny is in South Africa." On October 2, Reagan's veto was eventually overridden by Congress, with the Senate voting 78-21 and the House by 313-83. This override marked the first time in the 20th century that a president had a foreign policy veto overridden. Apartheid opponents in the United States and South Africa applauded the vote, while critics argued that it would be either ineffectual or lead to more violence. The override was seen as a major defeat for Reagan, coming at the hands of his fellow Republicans in Congress. What hurt Reagan the most was that he was to meet Mikhail Gorbachev in Iceland, the leader of the Soviet Union, prior to the veto. Reagan attempted to salvage his veto, making calls pleading with a number of senators, arguing he wouldn't want to appear weak and ineffective in Iceland if he were rebuffed by the Republican-controlled Senate on a major foreign policy question. He tried to bolster his cause by promising to impose some economic sanctions on his own and by appointing the first black ambassador to South Africa. However, these efforts only gained him 7 more votes than the total that opposed the bill in August.